So if you want to grab your Bibles and go over to our first reading this morning in the book of Genesis, chapter 1. So the season of Advent is always a special time in the church calendar because it's the only one where we get to hold two separate events together as one. It's when we look to the first coming of Jesus, which we'll celebrate during Christmas. You know, secularly speaking, it's already the Christmas season. Why? Because Advent is a penitential season, and penitence does not sell that well. So they moved it backwards. But as we acknowledge and celebrate Christmas here at the end of the month, we also look forward with hope for his return to finish the work he's begun of bringing justice and wholeness to the earth. And though we know that he has taken the right to his throne during his first coming, and he will establish his eternal reign in his second, and he is now seated at the right hand of the Father in the heavenly throne. But we do come to that question. We have to ask, how did we get there? And that is the story, in a sense, of Advent. It's the story we're going to be exploring through our series that we begin this morning, The Once and Future King, where we'll see, as one writer put it, how God became king. So in this first sermon of our series, we're going to start at the beginning. So if you're in Genesis chapter 1 this morning, we're going to be covering essentially the first 3 chapters. But for the sake of practicality, we only read what's going to be our centerpiece text for our consideration. And so these chapters, written arguably in a very unique literary style to the rest of the book of Genesis, can be broken down into 2 movements. We have paradise gained and paradise lost. And so we start with that first movement of paradise gained. And so going back to the very beginning of this chapter, we come to an opening line. And there's great importance to how you begin a story. One writer that I always turn to when I want to turn my brain off is Dean Koontz, who reached prominence in the 80s and 90s with his prolific catalog of thrillers and science fiction books, which are his better ones, not his seemed fascination with things about golden retrievers these days. But one thing that stands out about those novels he wrote was his ability to craft a perfect opening line. It's a line that somehow introduces a character, gives emotion, and draws you into the story yet to come. And best-selling authors know and understand the power of a first line, because despite arguments to the contrary, short attention spans are really nothing new. And if you cannot catch someone in the first sentence, then you probably will not hold them at all. And though I've never heard it mentioned in books or articles on writing or examinations of literature, the opening sentence to Genesis is everything you could ever look for in an opening line. You see, it does not begin with once upon a time, nor does it start with on a dark and stormy night. But instead, it takes us right to the action, right to the main point. It says, in the beginning, God created. This phrase sums up the entirety of the first chapter. It forms the framework of our belief. It's encapsulated in the ancient Christian creeds that there is one God who has created all things, both seen and unseen. And along with all of the awe that this statement brings, comes quickly the debates that are almost as heated and as controversial as the political arguments that one uncle we all have at Thanksgiving dinner. You'll be pleased to know that we won't be rehashing those arguments in the creation debate this morning. Why? Because people much smarter and wiser than me have done so for many years, and I have nothing useful to add to that discussion. And all I know is this: despite the window dressing of how it all happened, what's really important is the fact that it is God who has created. As we read a few weeks ago in Hebrews 11, it is by faith we believe that God created all things. And from what I've read and further from what I have understood is that though we get bogged down in the details, none of those details mattered to those Israelites leaving Egypt. What mattered to them was that all the false religions they had heard was wrong. And that it was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob who made all that it is, all that is. He created it good and with a purpose. He is the one who shaped the earth and brought chaos to order. He filled it with trees, grass, flowers, and air. He gave the wind a breath, directed the dew where to fall, and spread it out water among the oceans. The how and the why of all this was totally irrelevant. Because I'm willing to bet as they were gathered around wandering from Egypt, because Genesis developed as an oral tradition because they forgot to grab legal pads and ballpoint pens on their way out of Egypt. But as they were gathered around and Moses began to tell them these things, they were not concerned with the how and the why. They were just in awe that the God who had done all of that stooped down and rescued them. And in the same way, though all the debates around this first chapter are important discussions to have, certainly, they can often become more of a distraction than a help. Because if we spend more time debating the fine points of how it happened and the wording of how it happened, rather than worshiping the one who did it, then we are truly missing the forest for the trees. So, putting all this to the side and focusing on the main point of this passage, we look at as he created, he gave the earth, all this form, and then he introduced living things into it, all manners of animals, fish, shellfish, bacteria, lions, tigers, bears, whales, and caterpillars. And at the crown of this, looking out over this vast domain, this kingdom of nature and creatures, God decided to create one to bring his order and peace to it. He created humans and gave them a representative role in the creation. He made them his images and he gave them his likeness. And the idea of image and likeness are two separate concepts. But what I want to focus on this morning is that God made humans in his image. You see, in the ancient world, it was the practice of kings to put their image, a literal statue of them, in places where they wanted to establish their authority. You remember in the book of Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar building that large statue of himself. And this statue, this was seen mainly in Mesopotamian culture, but it also when it established their authority and reign in a visible way in their kingdom. But when it came to divinity, a statue or an image of one of their gods was a direct channel to the divine. And the Israelites, fresh from Egypt, would have picked this up. Egypt was full of these idol statues and full of images. And so when they hear this, as they're gathered around listening to Moses, when they hear this, what they understand is God made human beings as his direct channels to this world. And they were to be a symbol and establish his authority on earth. They were his first ambassadors. And this is much like in 1969 when Neil Armstrong and his crew landed on the moon and they placed the United States flag there as a marker of their presence and as a signal of the mighty accomplishment that had been made. So God planted his images there as a symbol of what he had done, as a symbol of his authority. And he told them to, verse 28, fill the earth and subdue it. Rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, and every creature that crawls on the earth. And with that responsibility came the benefit of sharing with him not only his authority, but also in the enjoyment of his creation. God also said, look, I have given you every seed-bearing plant on the surface of the entire earth, and every tree whose fruit contains seed. This will be food for you. For all the wildlife of the earth, for every bird of the sky, and for every creature that crawls on the earth, everything that having breath and of life in it, I have given every green plant for food. And it was so. And as God entrusted his new images in his paradise, he rested from his work. And what did he say about it? He said, it is good. But of course, as we know, the story will quickly take a dramatic shift. Because from this place of entering into and taking this paradise that was given, as the story moves on, we see paradise was lost. You see, there's a reason that most stories in our Western culture, at least the good ones, run on a common trajectory. That of someone who begins at the heights and plunges into darkness and struggle. Those stories survive because even though we do not always acknowledge this fact, they remind us somewhat primally of this story of all humanity. It was the reverse of the rags to riches story. They started at the top but fell to a great depth. And we know the story and the characters, Adam and Eve, a serpent with a big mouth, all gathered under the tree of knowledge. And the debate of how exactly this tree caused the fall, the exact identity of the serpent, and all of those other matters are getting lost in the details. But there's plenty of interesting ideas and explanations for those things. But for the sake of our purpose, we're going to stick with the bare facts of the story. We're going to go dragnet on this, just the facts, ma'am. And so the serpent figure enters the narrative, subtle and crafty, and begins to question Eve about why exactly they cannot take the tree of knowledge's fruit. And after a bit of back and forth, Eve makes the fatal error in 3 steps. She looks at the fruit and considers it. She sees it's good for food, rationalizing it. She eats the food, giving in, and shares it with Adam, spreading her sin. And it's here that the role they held was thrown away because they had gone from the ones who God set apart as his images and shared his authority with them to those who questioned God's authority and threw it away and defied him. Paradise was not lost through a tree, it was lost through rebellion. It was not taken over by a hostile authority, it was given over by turning away from authority. God had set them up as the ones who would order and rule the created world, tending the garden, naming and ruling over the animals who were there. And this was all to be a picture of how God ruled and cared for his creation, keeping them in holy order and not giving them over to chaos and destruction. But quite the opposite happened, because instead Adam and Eve exercising control and influence over the animals, including the serpents. They were the ones who were controlled and influenced. Instead of tending the garden, they defaced the tree of knowledge. They turned God's order on its head. And instead of submitting to God as king, they had dethroned him by their actions. And now the Lord could have chosen a number of courses to deal with this. He could have charged into the garden and at that very moment and with an accusing finger called them to account, demanding that they grovel before him, begging for his mercy. He could have destroyed them in that instant and started all over again with new and more obedient humans. And while those ideas are maybe abhorrent to our modern ears, we think, well, that would be a terrible way for that to work out. In the ancient world, that's the behavior that would have been expected. Their gods were cruel and arbitrary. In their minds, humans, they were not creatures in relationship, they were slaves to be ruled and punished. But that is not the God of the Bible. He chose a different way. When he came to visit them, he found they were hiding, and he called Adam to come out. And upon realizing they had eaten the fruit, he turns to Eve, and in words just as telling as that opening line, just as ringing in our ears, he says, "What have you done?" As a result of their fall, chaos has re-entered the world. God's order has been disrupted, and the blessings that are given have become twisted into a curse. Man would continue to labor as he tended the garden, but now he would tend the ground, and now it would come with toil and struggle. Women would bear children, be fruitful and multiply, but it would not be a joyful fulfillment. Now it would come with struggle. An interesting thing about this phrase, you can read at the end of chapter 3 where it lays all this out, came up in discussion with Monica one time because she and Heather are resident Genesis scholars, by the way, is when discussing this verse, there are a lot of tricky things surrounding the words in our English translations. And scholars tell us that when God said that the labor pains and childbearing would be more intense, it's the same phrasing, the same roots around the word for bearing children as was Adam's toil in the ground. Adam will toil, she will toil. There's poetic parallel. Just as Adam struggles with the ground to yield life and fruitfulness, so Eve will struggle with the womb to yield life and fruitfulness. And this encompasses not just the difficulty of delivering a child, and all the mothers in the room said amen, but also in the conception and bearing of a child, pregnancy. One way of rendering that phrase that I thought was really helpful was that there would be grief in childbearing. Things that God gave as joy to his images living with him are now tainted with a curse because they stepped away from order and peace. Sin entered the world and brought all manner of trouble with it. And now all the world, things outside of us and even things within us, are plunged into chaos. You want proof of that? Take a look at the world around us. We have wars that just never seem to end, poverty that rages unchecked, hunger, adults and children alike, even here in your local community. I can take you to a place where kids line up to get extra food to take home with them for a weekend. Disease, violence, crime, racism, classism, elitism, unemployment, infertility, depression, anxiety, suicide, and that's just in the United States. This is what the world looks like outside of God's rule. This is what it looks like when God's image is not being reflected. This is how it is when paradise is lost. But as Advent reminds us, we are not left in the dark without hope. Like all the great stories we have, humanity is one of a fall from a great height. And despite our progress, despite our advancement and our development, here we still stand. But just like in all of those stories, there is a third act. There is a heroic return when all is resolved, when everything is set right again. From Odysseus to Frodo Baggins to Luke Skywalker, for every fall, there is a rising again. The story of that third act is what Advent is about. From man's fall comes God's return, where the first Adam forsook his place as God's image. Christ showed himself to be the true image of God. Where Adam and Eve left joyful labor for painful toil, Jesus took on painful toil and grief for joy in life. In a world we live in that's so fractured and broken, Advent is a beacon of hope for all of us. So no matter how dark it may be when you look out there, no matter how confusing or how troubling, no matter what hunger and pain you may see, sickness and death you are confronted with, no matter what pain you're facing in your personal life, there is an answer to it, because you are not left alone to wander in the dark. You are not left to pain and grief of the fall. But there is hope to be found, because Advent is the story of the once and future King. The King who created and ruled all things, and when they turned away and rebelled, his love remained steadfast. And in our darkness, a new light dawned. And a new creation is dawned through the one whose name is above every name, who is Lord and King of all. So as we go through this series, this Advent season, we're going to see how God became King. We're going to follow that third act all the way to Christmas, where we see the new hope dawn. Amen?